Our team at S7 has spent the better part of the past 15 years working at the intersection of leadership and major market shifts, including what's been called the sustainability revolution. This movement was predicated on the idea that businesses could lead humanity out of ecological crisis and social ills because doing good it was better for business and therefore also for shareholders. The movement has had many faces, among them people, planet, and profit, also known as the triple bottom line, shared value, pioneered by Harvard's Michael Porter and Mark Kramer, and not least the latest, stakeholder capitalism. It felt almost as though the game was won. There would be drawbacks for sure, and the pace would never be fast enough, but we had found the right path and would stick to it. In the midst of all of this, there was one more or less lone and slightly disturbing voice calling it all a bluff. His name is Tariq Fancy, and he's our next guest. Tariq is the former chief investment officer at BlackRock. He's a Canadian, and these days he runs a digital education startup called Rumi and teaches at Stanford. In 2021, Tariq wrote a series of remarkable blogs that argued that sustainability agendas were no more than marketing. Even more crucially, he pointed out that they were dangerous distractions because they created cover for governments to avoid doing the hard and painful work of changing the rules that created the problems sustainability hoped to solve in the first place. In today's conversation, we get into how recent events have unfortunately proven Tariq's analysis true. But we also get to hear his masterful take on power and politics. We dig past the typical focus on Trump's shenanigans and speculation into what would impel such large numbers of Americans to vote for it. We get into the questions behind the questions, like this one. Why the fuck do Democrats keep losing so badly? His answer will both surprise you and point, I believe, to where we in Europe should be focusing if we want to avoid getting dragged into the pit, as Tariq puts it, the US is in. I'm also proud to say that this episode is the final installment in our first series of WTF Now by S7. We've covered a range of topics from the energy transition and populism to where big tech went very, very wrong. More exciting and clarifying conversations to come after the summer. Until then, please take good care of yourselves. So Tariq, great to see you again. Thanks so much for agreeing to join us from what I understand is a very sunny and hot Croatia.
That's right. I'm in Zagreb, and it is sort of a heat wave here, as it is in a bunch of other places right now, from what I hear.
5 years ago, the Business Roundtable heralded a new era of what they called stakeholder capitalism. It sounded transformative, but progress has mostly been performative. And now, amid political and economic uncertainty, those promises are being quietly shelved. Many of the really impressive targets that we enjoyed hearing about from private companies have been either scaled back or removed completely. And in parallel, climate impacts are starting to bite. So first question to you, has stakeholder capitalism already run its course? Or do you feel it's worth reviving? What are your feelings on this?
I think the question comes down to what we mean by stakeholder capitalism. I think if we actually mean a business that serves the public interest better, including all of its stakeholders, employees, and so on, it's a good idea. The question is, how does it come about? And what the business community produced, and let's call it ESG 1.0 and a bunch of marketing around it, was this promise that it'll magically unfold because, people suddenly discover stakeholders exist and it's important to their business. In practice, all of those things are true. They could be important to your business, but you don't actually do them if it's not profitable for shareholders. And now the US, most companies are registered in Delaware. There's very clear law around that. It's almost annoying because the marketing just seemed to move contrary to all of the facts around their financial incentives, around their legal obligations, and so on. So I think stakeholder capitalism as an idea that we need to, make capitalism better, we need that to happen. The issue is the mechanisms they chose were just entirely marketing oriented. And I think revealed that the goal of it was not actually to develop stakeholder capitalism as much as it was to react to public pressure to do so with some kind of a placebo that just delays the situation and keeps the party going, where let's be honest, the CEO class who are talking about stakeholder capitalism get richer than they ever have at any point in history. I mean, they get paid more than the average industry worker. It's at a peak. Their tenure is shorter. You have a situation where, the wolves are saying we've been eating the sheep, but now we've discovered stakeholder capitalism. We're going to stop eating the sheep. And it's like,
Right.
okay, well, it's a good idea, but maybe we need some enforcement around it. And so maybe some of these commitments should be mandatory rather than voluntary.
Right. Okay. So you said a few things that I'd like to dig in a little bit there. The first around Delaware. What obligations do these companies have when they're incorporated in Delaware?
Yeah, I mean, the simplest thing, the way to think about it is that the money that they are spending is not their own money, right? Whether you're a portfolio manager investing the assets of some pension fund at BlackRock, or you're Amazon, you're an employee and you're going to build a new factory or data center, you're using someone else's money, right? The shareholders' money or pensioners' money. This problem is the core of capitalism. It's the principal agent problem, right? The agent is operating on behalf of the principal, let's say managing money. And in that situation, you have a set of legal obligations, the key of which is fiduciary duty, which means you have to actually act in their best interests, right? And so the key then comes down to a lot of people in the green space say, oh, the best interests are fighting climate change. Yeah, of course. But you have to understand the legal mechanism, right? The mechanism says that you can't look at values. You have to look at value, right? And there's a long history of case law around this. And I would recommend one of the best people to read around this is a guy called Leo Strine, a lawyer who was formerly the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Delaware and what the New York Times called probably corporate America's most influential judge. And he's written a lot around these issues and the fact that, the way it's structured, you would need to show that this good thing you're doing for stakeholders actually benefits shareholders. Otherwise, you'll get sued. You could show that sometimes, right? You could say, hey, if you treat your employees better, it's going to be better for shareholder returns. That's not always true. That's not always over a timeline that people are focused on. And most importantly, there's a lot of cases where people do bad things for the world that are in their shareholders' interest, right? Let me go pollute over there, right? And then I don't pay any costs and I dumped it in some emerging economy or somewhere where there's no cost to that. So you end up in a situation where these ideas sound nice, but in practice, people inside the system know that they're not constructed to solve the problem because, the expert answer is that you need mandatory regulations, right? Again, I use a lot of sports analogies and it's like, okay, this is a competitive sport. The players are out there trying to get every point they can. If they can leverage dirty play or a loophole to score more points, they'll do it because that's what the competition is. And that's the culture of business, whether we like it or not, over the last 50 years of shareholder capitalism has gone in that direction. And so the answer is that if you want to close the loopholes, you got to call on the refs.
So if you were a little bit cynical, Tariq, you could say that
I'm quite cynical actually in general these days, but go on. There's no need for the if.
Okay, right. So you could say that if sustainability and taking care of stakeholders and addressing climate change was like in societies like zeitgeist, then CEOs who set targets, talked about those things, would be fulfilling their fiduciary duty by talking in a way that was going to attract the public to buy their products and services because it was in. And then as soon as it became not in, they would still be doing their fiduciary duty if they backseated it and started talking about it less and started talking about other things. So in a way, it's no mystery that they did what they did.
100%. That's exactly what happened. What's the saying? The proof is in the eating of the pudding. So let's look at myself versus my old boss, Larry Fink at BlackRock, right? And him and BlackRock are the ones I called out, not because they were the worst at it, but because they're the largest firm, they're making the most noise, and that's where I worked. And that's where I think everyone demands accountability. Fink was saying years ago that this is about investing. You're going to make more money if you solve for what stakeholders want, and that works in any situation. It's the way of the future. If that were true, then when the Republicans came along and they said, "Hey, by the way, why are you doing all this ESG stuff?" He would have said, "Go pound sand." Right? We're legally obligated as fiduciaries to make money. This stuff makes money. And then it turns Republicans and say, well, you guys don't like making money? And then they would shut up and they'd go make money and they'd be happy. In reality, and the Republicans actually, this can sound odd, to their credit, figured this out, that it was greenwashing and it was marketing. And so they started attacking it, and they had some fair points because a lot of what was under the S and ESG often veered, at least in the US, into sort of areas around gender ideology that I think they fairly said, like, there's no clear link to financial return, and these are cultural questions, and Larry Fink should be deciding them. There is an argument that actually makes sense, but anyway, be that as it may, they started attacking it, and they said, hey, this doesn't make sense at all, right? This is not good for returns. Now, if there's a tell here, right? I said it was PR and marketing. Larry Fink said it's about investing. When the Republicans attacked, if it was about investing, he would have said, this is about investing, like, get out of here, we're going to make money. Instead, he revealed that it's about PR, right? Is exactly as you said. The value to the company as a fiduciary was that I say all this nice green stuff, right? And why is it good for shareholder returns? Well, number one, I respond to the social angst that's growing around our lack of addressing these issues, especially amongst younger people, by number one, fending off regulations, because I push a narrative that says that the market will self-correct all by itself. That's probably good for their returns in the near term if it meant that they might have to pay taxes, or people have to pay carbon taxes, or any kind of fines on exploiting the environment, right? Now you can just get away with it and destroy the planet more. And by the way, you could just paint a bunch of existing products green and sell it into that growing social angst. That's exactly what it was. And once the PR value receded, they just moved away, right? And I think another example is Black Lives Matter, right? If you look at George Floyd and the whole situation, we live in a world where there are camera phones everywhere, right? We're seeing that in Gaza and all that. People see what's going on, and when they see what's going on, they get angry, and rightly angry, right? And so the business world, if they actually cared about the Black community in a real way, they would go and actually change how they do business. They would say, hey, we probably shouldn't be skirting taxes, and that could be used to fund education in poor Black communities in the US. Like when I did Big Brothers and that little brother in the housing projects, they would actually make a real commitment to that. Instead, they started talking a bunch of PR, right? And they had to at that moment in time, right? They realized that you have to virtue signal because there was a lot of anger. But it was just virtue signal because they've recanted on most of those promises. And I think the losers ultimately are not the shareholders of those companies. The losers are society, not only because the communities affected don't get a fair treatment of their issues. I think much worse, it just destroys the public's entire faith in the system, right? Oddly, the most cynical people I meet these days are like young people, which is something that I didn't see a few years ago. But I think to myself, if you're a political constituency that is most leveraged to the long term, and you keep hearing all these leaders say, oh yeah, we're going to do all this stuff to address the science that you're learning in your classroom is real every single day, and they don't do shit, you might sort of start to think, okay, like let's try something else. And you might start to assume that all leaders are liars and vote for an outsider.
Why can't these CEOs just be good people and do the right thing? But the fiduciary duty aspect of this requires them to behave in a certain way if they want to stay in the chair. And in a way, you could say that given the arc of history over the past 10 to 15 years, they've actually behaved very rationally and very predictably. If the rules were different, they might have acted differently, but the rules are not different.
That's exactly it. I think ultimately the system is producing the outcomes it's designed to produce, right? You have everyone locked into relationships where they have fiduciary duty. And at the end of the line, most of the capital in the economy, it really belongs to us, right? It's our pension funds and our futures. But it goes to the financial system, and these change the link between an asset owner, a pension fund, to an asset manager, let's say BlackRock, that invests it in a company, ExxonMobil, whoever it is. And along the links of that chain, everybody is trying to make as much money as they can because they're legally obligated and probably financially incentivized to do that. And at the end of the chain, you have market failure. And so people aren't paying the costs of the pollution that they're causing on the environment, right? Especially with greenhouse gas emissions. And, the system just keeps exploiting exactly what you mentioned. Now, what's kind of interesting about it, though, is that in a sense, if you look at today's business leadership and political leadership, we've built systems that evolve exactly the kind of people who probably don't talk about it, right? Because as you mentioned, during the last 15 years, what fiduciary duty tells us you have to do. And so we could sit and say, well, why aren't these CEOs more responsible? But I would flip it around and say, well, the system at this point wouldn't let someone who's responsible become the CEO, right? You wouldn't get there unless you were greed is good to the ultimate maximum and you just want to squeeze all this money out. Ultimately, the system will spit out and chew out people who are willing to like speak openly about it. Like there's no scenario I can become a CEO of an asset manager and be saying what I'm saying right now, right? Because they'd be pulling in different directions. I think the worst thing about that, though, is actually what it's done to the political system. Because 15 years ago is around the time that the United States Supreme Court passed the Citizens United decision, which just unlocked unlimited and traceless political spending. That I think is destroying democracy because it's corrupted both American political parties and, by definition, it's dragging the rest of Western democracy. I can say this as a Canadian who grew up 2 hours from the border. We're all getting dragged into a pit by them. And sometimes people will ask me, they'll say, well, why don't we have honest politicians, right? And why are most of them dishonest? And I'll say, well, the system has now for years rewarded them for doing what donors want because donors are financing both parties in extraordinary numbers. So the honest person wouldn't get there. Like the honest person is the exception. It's the Bernie Sanders who somehow has managed to like say the same thing for 30, 20, 30, 40 years and is, I think, the number one most trusted senator in America because people know that he's like that. And I think I have nothing good to say about establishment Democrats. So don't even get me started because I think that I've come across people from that. I've worked with people. I mean, at the end of the day, I think the core of it is that they'll say anything to get elected and get ahead. And I think if you evolve a leadership class that is that corrupt, it reminds me of there's a Singaporean diplomat and author called Kishore Mahbubani, very well known. And I started reading his stuff 20 years ago, and I met him a few years ago in Singapore. He had written a book called Has China Won? And he's been arguing for decades now that the Asian system will beat Western democracy because they can plan long term. And I sat down and I explained all this to him. And at the end, he just looked at me and he just said, the US elite are corrupt. And then I paused. And then he told me it's 2021 and I've not gotten past that. Ultimately, if you have enough people who are not willing to say what's right, then the system will collapse.
The structure creating behavior or the system creating what it's designed to create is sort of a surprisingly obvious and yet extremely insightful point, because whether we're talking about the economy, whether we're talking about CEOs, whether we're talking about politicians on either side of whichever aisle, you could say that that point of view is true. And that's sort of on your sustainable investing discussion too that you've been having for years. You've been saying it's fundamental. The rules need to be changed. And until the rules need to be changed, we're going to continue to be here.
That's exactly it. And you know what? If you get to rule changes, you get to a whole separate conversation. What are those rule changes? Is it a economy-wide price on carbon? That's really hard to get through voters. Is it, in sector by sector, sort of targets and limits? There's a bunch of different things you can do. I think it's quite clear based on what I'm seeing in China that you actually can build an economy that moves quite fast and produces a lot of green stuff. Because people will look at their emissions and then say, oh, their emissions are really high. And I said, wait a second, like that's because they're building all our iPhones and everything else, right? That's a carbon accounting thing. But in practice, what Xi Jinping has been able to do is to actually use the power of the state to say we need to move in a direction. So Xi Jinping says we're only going to have EVs by 2035. Here's what happens. A bunch of Chinese car makers say, oh, shit, like that means we got to spend a lot more money on R&D. Right. And we're going to make less money. We have less to pay our shareholders. And then they say, oh, shit, well, Xi Jinping said it, so I guess we have to do it at the end. Here's what happens in the U.S., right? The same thing happens if someone says that and they say, oh, man, we got to spend more on R&D. We got to pull all that spending up. We had that money all, set up to buy back shares, make a few $100 million in a few years. I don't want to do this other thing. And so what they end up doing is they basically get their lobbyists, they use political spending, and then you can't actually get that. It is in the public interest to do that in 10 or 15 years, but you're not going to get that done if it's not in the short-term interest of the people who are greedy and financing the political system, right? So I think ultimately we're just kind of in this position where, what the fundamental biggest concern I have is that we've been lied to about how our own system works around capitalism and democracy. And I spent the first quarter teaching a class at Stanford on how capitalism and democracy are supposed to work. And like, long story short, they don't work. They've worked so poor for 15, 20 years that the population's willing to vote for an outsider and just whoever breaks and resets the system, and it seems anti-establishment. And I think we got the wrong guy, right, in there. But you could sort of see this transition from almost crony capitalism to, while we're teaching the class, and for good measure, we started teaching on January 6th, which was my first foray into teaching.
Wow. Okay.
Right, and we started teaching it, and we were doing it to the backdrop of what increasingly looks like open corruption. Right, so we're in a tough place. But
We are,
ultimately,
right.
the biggest issue is that we've been lied to about how our own system works, and that's what I wanted to get at with the stuff I was writing, was that we're not going to get anywhere unless we can have an honest debate about how the system works, and then therefore how we change it, which really comes down to mandatory rule changes.
Exactly. And in an authoritarian state, when the big guy, when the boss says this is what we're going to do, that is sort of a de facto rule that works in an authoritarian state. And sometimes those rules go in positive directions and sometimes not. And I think in terms of the green transition, China's been extremely interesting. And they've also done something that I'm particularly fascinated by. And that is, 10 to 15 years ago, we'd have been saying, you can't expect a lot of innovation out of China. They're really, really, really good at, copying was what was said, right? But I think what we've seen now when it comes to the green transition across a number of different parts of it, including cars, UI, now batteries, BYD with tremendous battery innovations, arguably maybe even more interesting than some of what Tesla's done, right? You're seeing an extremely fast-moving, focused, innovative China that is dominating value chains around the world for some of these keen green technologies, and at the same time, strategically weaning themselves off of volatile energy markets beyond their borders. So it's quite an impressive set of moves.
Yeah, I mean, the most interesting about China, I've lived in Asia in the past. I've spent 2 stints in Singapore, and I actually lived in China, in Shanghai, for a period about 13 years ago. I did a turnaround of a software company. I saw then that we had underestimated their abilities significantly. I mean, early on, they were definitely emulating, copying. There was IP theft, a bunch of things in the past, but that had transitioned in the 2000s into something where they were actually leading and a lot of digital innovation. They were leading in payment systems and all these apps and other things. And you could see that growth continuing. So I think vis-a-vis China, we've got 2 challenges. One is that in the West, we had not realized how fast they had actually produced very good technology, to the point where now we have to put up tariffs to protect our own green industries, which is incredible. And so that poor long-term planning has given them a massive edge. I think the second thing that's really important for Westerners to understand, is someone, I grew up in Canada. I've studied in 4 universities outside of Canada, in the US, UK, France, and Singapore. My parents grew up in Africa. We're South Asian background. I speak Spanish and Portuguese. I've done a Latin American. I love to travel. I've been around a lot of places. The West has lost all its credibility in the last few years. It's not just that they are producing better products and they're selling them all over emerging markets where there are not tariffs. It's also that, everything negative we could have said about them around human rights has been flipped on its head in the last few years because, my parents grew up in Africa. I have relatives still there. I mean, they look at this stuff and they say, hey, weren't you the guys talking about human rights? It seems to me that you're ready to throw Greta Thunberg out the window because she's smuggling humanitarian aid into a starving population. All of what we've done in the last couple of years, and the way that free speech is actually being removed by the business community and now politicians to even talk about it in Western countries, they're noticing that. I mean, can you imagine people of color sitting there? I mean, my uncle told me, he's like, listen, man, they ran a black woman for president whose campaign includes supporting racial apartheid. We're the continent of Mandela. You can't gaslight us that much, right? So I think I think it's, my concern has always been not just capitalism in our economy and our business community. It's the extent to which that community is willing to tell us things that are not true and to act in their own self-interest in ways that destroy the trust that we have in the system. And if you look at public trust and how it's declining, and it has declined in years, you would wonder if this is the moment when we look back and we say, this is the end of the West. Because our own populations don't believe in what we're doing anymore, in part because we have elites that, that are willing to gaslight them.
A quick break from the serious stuff. If you're enjoying the podcast, please give us a like, leave a review, or hit follow. It helps more people find What the Fuck Now, and it keeps our algorithm overlords happy. The second topic comes from a conversation that we had on sustainability a number of months ago. And I made the mistake in discussion with you of mentioning the words left and right, and then you challenged that and you said, I think it's about something else, Rick. Why don't you give us a rundown on that?
Well, so I think the simplest way to do it is to think about following the money, right? So start by following the money. If you follow the money, you'll generally figure out what's going on and why, regardless of the marketing that's layered on top. Now, generally, an organization or institution is going to react to where they get their money from, right? So Apple is, we all stop buying iPhones, they're going to react because the money comes in the door through that, right? If you have to pay attention to your customers. I think fundamentally the question we have to ask about political systems, and I think the U.S. is the most obvious example, but the rest of the West is somewhat culpable, is who are your political parties and who are their customers? Well, you might think that the customers of, let's say, the Democratic Party of America are the grassroots or the voters. I would argue that if you look at the last 15 years, their customers are the donors, right? There's a tension between their donors and the grassroots and the voters. And you see that tension always facing up, and they tend to almost always go with the donors from what I've seen. And so if that's the case, then what do donors want, right? Well, on the economic side, and this is the important thing, in the US, notice that the biggest bullshit will be that the press will talk about the left and the far left, and they'll never actually say, do you mean the economic left or the cultural left? And that's the key distinction. What do the donors want? They're paying money to finance the campaign. So they're going to keep a close eye on your economic policies. And if you want to do anti-poverty program, it's like, that's going to cost money. So I don't know about that, right? Oh, what about reparations for descendants of slaves? Oh, that's going to cost a lot of money. Climate change, that's going to cost a lot of money. So they don't really want to do that, right? The money is going to try to keep itself with the money. They're not going to finance the campaign of tax reform. That's ridiculous. They'd never do that. So in practice, what's happened is that both parties have now moved to the right. Right. And you see that happening with the Democrats whose economic policies are Republican-like. And that's really interesting because you also notice them leaning heavily into culture. Right. And they're just saying, oh, what we really need to fight about is like not the anti-poverty program for Black communities. It's about separating the poor white and poor Black students and teaching the white ones that they're anti-racist, whatever, all the anti-racism stuff. It's all cultural stuff, renaming statues, right? Changing words. I always found personally, as having been a student at a scholarship at an Ivy League school in the U.S., that they didn't seem to understand class. Everything was about culture amongst the elite. And so what we've evolved is a system that actually looks top-bottom on economics, because the top are the rich people, right, and the old people. And the system is going to do their bidding because, they're the ones pulling the strings, right? And so they're not planning on the long term. They're not doing tax reform. They're not, the intergenerational transfer is ridiculous. Poor young people can't buy a house or anything, right, because of government policy has inflated the value of all these assets. So it's really very clearly top-bottom on economics. But on culture, it's left-right. Right. And culture, I would argue that actually what I've seen with Democrats is that as they've gotten pulled to the right on the economics, they try to compensate with culture because their grassroots wants what Bernie Sanders is talking about. That's why he polls so highly. But in practice, they can't run on that because the donors won't let them. So he plays the party mascot, right? But he never gets to actually run. And then they put call a spade a spade. They put some stooge in place, right? Who, effectively is going to do their bidding on economics and probably lean heavily into culture or identity, right, in order to mask what's actually going on, right? I mean, the Black-white household income gap actually grew under 8 years of Obama. I wouldn't call Obama a stooge. But Kamala Harris, I'm sorry, she's a stooge. I mean, in the election campaign, there was a moment where she actually said, yeah, of course I got a Glock at home. She's talking about a gun. I have friends who are donors, right? And I looked at that and I called them up and they're all like, fuck, like, no way. Like, no one believed it. If you had a Glock, say it years ago and be real about it. If you don't say it. But if you say it in an election campaign where you're very clearly trying to move to the center and this, that, the lack of authenticity is just so annoying. But it is at its core a top bottom economic system because of how it's financed. And the left, right, but is only on culture, and they lean into that because, frankly, if you're an economic elite, the best thing possible is to distract from the Bernie Sanders type people who want to confiscate your wealth, in your view, and distract people towards a left-right cultural war. And we're seeing that now.
Tariq, we've been trying to promote this podcast a little bit because it's very new. We've been really wise or really stupid and basically put a curse in the title of the podcast itself. In the US, they've told us if you want to promote, you need to basically register as somebody who's engaging in like campaigning and election oriented speech.
That
So,
is,
you said that the messaging is being like censored by businesses, and it absolutely is.
I mean, the wildest part is if you look at the data in the US, where Facebook is or Meta is based, over 70% of Americans think that the economic system is rigged to benefit the wealthy and powerful. And that's been like for 10 years now, right? And this, really, since the financial crisis, people realized that there was an elite who got rich off it and didn't face any accountability. And so you have over 70% of people think the system's rigged. Over 80% think big donors have too much influence. Now, my message to every European, right, and I'm saying this as a Canadian, is number one, we just can't listen to what's coming out of the US anymore. Like, if there's a moment for us to stand up and lead, like, it has to be now, right, under Trump too. But the second message I would say is just look at all this data and think to yourself, we're being told the American electorate is polarized. They don't sound that polarized from those two data points. I think they're actually all generally in agreement that their political class is corrupt and untrustworthy, right? But that political class seems to evolve the system where they do really well personally on both sides of the aisle, in and out of office, and don't seem to achieve any of the things that they say on the surface. It's not a great, it's not a great, a great place to be. And I think, right now we have to sort of start to question a lot of the things that are going on, because if Facebook goes and says, like, people are outside storming the Bastille, you know what I mean? Like, the data is showing that. And then Facebook is saying, oh, like, through this channel, you can't get too uppity. It reminds me of like when I started saying stuff publicly, eventually I got annoyed and would just be like, this is obviously, bullshit. Right. And 4 years later, my essays are assigned reading in business school. I teach at a business school. Larry Fink doesn't say ESG anymore. And it
Right.
sounds great. You know what I mean? But it's like, he ran a PR strategy. He still got all the money. Pension funds in Norway invest in BlackRock, right? Where is the accountability? Like, what kind of leadership is this at this moment in time? And do we want to be complicit in what looks like an attempt to shape a narrative that it runs completely counter to Western democracy, completely counter to the Western, Enlightenment values of free debate and open inquiry? And I can speak as someone who went out of my way to try to start a debate and was unable to. There is no accountability, right? And so I think fundamentally, to say that, like, the WTF acronym is the problem, rather than the fact that we're not allowing an honest debate while people are ready to storm Bastille, is pretty incredible.
Have you thought through any scenarios? What would it take to bust the gridlock? How badly does this have to go before it can start to go better?
I think there's one glimmer of hope I've seen recently, and I think we get nowhere if Western democracies have what I call a fake left, right? A fake left is a bunch of people who hang out at Davos talking with billionaires about how they're going to save a system that that they've been complicit in creating and benefit from. Like, it's just ridiculous. It's just marketing, right? And so I think what we need is someone that questions that. I think it's got to be the parties of the left, because they can provide an economic left that counters the nativist right? Because right now, people are looking to, scapegoats. They're saying, oh, it's the immigrants and this, that, and the other. And it seems a lot of it is redirecting economic angst that actually should be directed at elites of all colors, right? Wherever they are, brown guys in banking too. But that's not happening, right? And so I think if we can remake the left, we actually get to a place where we have a chance. I think that means that we've got to get the Wall Street Democrats out and send them back where they belong, which is the Republican Party, frankly.
Right.
And I think the
Yeah.
closest we're seeing to that is we saw in 2016 the Bernie Sanders thing come, and it was very clear that that's who the people wanted, right? I mean, he would have rallies and it'd get like bigger crowds than Hillary Clinton with, showing up with Jay-Z and Beyonce, right? I mean, it was very clear that that's who the people wanted. He went from single digit recognition to suddenly beating Hillary Clinton in 2 out of the 3 Rust Belt states that determined the presidency, right out of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And so you saw that that's where the energy was. But the biggest problem was he got blocked by his own party
Yeah.
because they want to stay rich and be able to feel virtuous through identity politics, and the economic left is not convenient to their financial interests. But what we have seen in the last week is an extraordinary upset in New York, where the mayoral candidate for the Democratic Party ended up being this guy Zoran Mamdani. And what is so fascinating about him is that, first of all, he's extremely articulate, and he makes a lot of points in ways that most of the population agree with. And so what you're seeing now, and this is something really fascinating, is that you look at all of his policy positions, right? He's from the Bernie Sanders and AOC and that sort of wing on the economic bit. And he talks somewhat about culture, but he's really focused on economics, right? And these are the things that people in New York City care about. New York City is a place where I spent a long time and learned, the trade, and it's, a lot of stuff starts there. It's a pretty dynamic, place if you can break through sort of some of the blockers. And I think right now he presents a hope for young people, right, that I think is very interesting. But the most curious thing that we should pay attention to if you're young or you're European is how the press describes him. Every
Okay.
single time they say, "Oh, he's the far left. He's the far left." So I said, let me go and go away from our press. This is the Financial Times I was reading, who I like, and I've written stuff for them, and I'm like, okay, this doesn't make sense. Let me just go and try someone else. Let me ask AI, right? Because if I ask ChatGPT, technically it's just going to be averaging what everyone's saying
Sure.
online and
Everything.
giving statistically relevant answers. So I said, go through all the Pew Center studies, right? And look at what Americans are saying they want, and then look at his party platform. It's fully lined. He's a centrist. The majority of the population is actually asking for what he's giving. Meanwhile, the press is calling him far left. So the question is he far left on a scale that is of your political class, or is it of your population? Well, your political class is unliked by your population and controlled by money. So, like, if I don't think Andrew Cuomo is the center, like, it's fucking ridiculous, actually. I don't know anyone on left or right who really likes the guy, right? But I think the donors love him, right? And they're the ones controlling it. And they've pulled the political apparatus and apparently the media to a point where a guy who just comes up from the masses and says, look, I think this is what people care about, and starts voicing what the population cares about, and unsurprisingly wins an upset, is being referred to as far left. I mean, I would turn to the press and say, whose side are you on? It doesn't seem like it's the people anymore.
If he's far left, what is the press? And it would seem that the press is aligned with the money.
Generally speaking, they know who butters their bread, right? I mean, in the last few years, I saw firsthand an extraordinary. The one of the amazing thing about going out of your way to start, frankly, start a fight, right? Which is kind of what I did, a debate, an intellectual fight. But is I left BlackRock on good terms at a going away party. A year and a half later, in the middle of the pandemic, I wrote this essay and released it because I thought, look, we live in democracies and this needs to be subject to debate. And I emailed them the night before. I said, hey, guys, liked working with you. I enjoyed it, but we live in democracies, and I understand the difference between my day job, which is, working for a company that's a set of legal obligations and financial incentives. You could change many companies in your lifetime, right? I don't know if they care about me that much. Would I die for my company? Probably not. When I leave the office, what am I? I'm a citizen in a democracy. I'm a Canadian. I've only ever been a Canadian. I didn't get a green card when I lived in the US for years. And it means something to me, right? And it means something to me that the country that I was born in, the first in my family of immigrants from Africa, like, we have to live up to the values that we talk about. And I think, you know, that's the difference, where it's you leave the office and you realize that, like, I have a responsibility in democracy. And so I went out there and I tried to start a debate. And the interesting thing about it was watching how the press responded, because you saw this interesting divergence between the journalists, who are individual human beings, a ton of whom I got to know and I really like, because they're just like you or me, doing a different job and they're part of a different apparatus and they have to produce different outcomes and work on one hand, and sort of what seemed to be the directions they were taking from the top. And you could see it because I went to a Bloomberg conference at the Bloomberg New Economy Forum in Singapore in late 2021. This is where I met Kishore Mahbubani. And the reason I had this conversation where he said the elites are corrupt is because I basically got deplatformed at the last minute. Go all the way to Singapore, and it's a lot of emissions to tell people that we're running out of time to reduce our emissions, but we're in a race against time. And then they boot me off the panel, and then journalists, they said, listen, 80% of our revenue at Bloomberg comes from the banks. We agree with you, right? The journalists want to write this stuff up, but ultimately we can't put you on stage to embarrass our biggest clients, which is probably what I would have done because I would have called bullshit on them. And so I've just seen inside out across the board, all of the press where the journalists themselves were getting pulled like in a direction that was different from what I could tell their heart's intent was. I think that we have to have a set of conversations around that. And I think the longer we wait, the more we just eat ourselves alive, right? I mean, I don't know how the press can, democracy dies in darkness was Jeff Bezos's claim, right? Or whatever, when he bought the Washington Post. And then obviously Trump turned around and said, I'm going to destroy the rest of your business interests if Washington Post says anything that I don't like. And then he sort of, he basically told them not to say anything, right? And so democracy died in darkness. But I would take issue with anyone saying that Trump is the end of democracy. I think he's a symptom of the fact that we allowed ourselves to be duped into believing that democracy still existed after the financial crisis, when the majority of the population had lost faith in that fact. And I think, right now, the most important thing for the press to understand is that Trump is he's not the only threat to democracy. He could be a threat to democracy, but ultimately the threat came earlier by the fact that we allowed this elite capture. We allowed these debates to move in directions where the public was just not buying it. And now, the majority of people younger than me don't even believe in capitalism.
I think you could trace it back to the financial crisis, like you just said, and to Citizens United, which you've mentioned as well, right? And those events allowed a series of events that brought us to where we are today, right? And then it'll be interesting to see what happens next. Great to hear that you feel that there's something promising, that's emerged with the Democratic primary for the mayor's seat in New York. Hopefully there will be some more. Because it's going to take more, isn't it?
I think it is going to take more. And I think that we're going to find that this guy Zoran, he doesn't just represent himself. He represents a grassroots movement that is starting to wake up again, that I think had to wake up and start to say more, given the devastating loss, right? And the complete failure of the establishment-led Democrats, who have again and again foisted candidates onto their party that the party didn't really want, that the grassroots had no interest in. And I think he represents something big, but the one most important thing to watch out for is that his big opponent will not be the Republicans, right? That entire movement he represents, they'll troll him, they'll talk about him, they'll fire up their base by saying, look at this democratic socialist, blah, 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 blah. But we saw this in 2016 with Bernie Sanders, the real threat is going to come from the Democratic establishment, because they're going to try to block him and that entire movement before they grow into something that hurts their interests. And honestly, if you just think of it this way, this is not cynical, it's just realism, right? There are a bunch of elite left-leaning people in places like New York, right? The coastal elites, right? That control the Democratic Party. They lean left socially, but they got a lot of money and want low taxes. So what do they want? They want low taxes and identity politics being the way to do the left. They don't want the people who are going to come and tax them and make them pay their fair share. And so they would rather risk, from what I can tell, democracy and losing the election to Trump. And in some part, Trump is probably not going to hurt their economic interest. They're still going to stay rich, and then he'll say a bunch of bad things. But like the big donors that finance the Democratic Party are not in the crosshairs of Donald Trump, right? Like they maybe don't like it and they wasted money on Kamala Harris, but like they're not getting kicked out of the country by ICE, right? They're not getting their free speech on college campuses, right? They're not seeing their futures get destroyed by economic policies that mean that they can't afford a house, right? They actually are very nicely ensconced in a position where they get to do what I call getting virtue at the lowest possible price, because they keep an economic system at top bottom and they're in the top. And then it's all this cultural nonsense is the political system fighting over, where they get to, virtue at the cheapest possible price will come from the identity politics wing of the Democratic Party, not the Bernie Sanders wing. So I think we should keep a close eye on Zoran, because I think his biggest threat is going to come from those folks, not from the Republicans.
I think the point that you made where you said that the establishment Democratic Party keeps giving the people candidates they don't want. Maybe that's been true in almost every case. You said Sanders, but since Obama and Sanders, right? It's been a series of those. And so the
100%.
next time we have a national election, it's going to be interesting to see if that happens again. Because in a way, given some of the Pew Research numbers that you named, doing that again is basically just a conscious choice to lose. But as you say, the downside of losing may not be that bad.
We're at this tough moment in history where I think your listener base probably skews European, but as a Canadian, I'm in Europe now, banging the drums that as all the Canadians have learned, we were complacent for a long time. That was a bad idea. There's a moment where we need real leadership and vision. I don't know if we're going to get that in Canada, but I look to Europe to say, like, if we're not having these conversations right now, right, about building a real movement that people believe in, particularly out of the left, number one, we're not going to be able to keep the far right at bay much longer, right? Because the identity politics left, that's never going to win against a right that's attacking Davos, right? Like, if the parties of the left have all the people at Davos, right, which they are the insider parties right now, right? They are the establishment. Unless we can break that, we're going to lose young people. I mean, the Democrats lost young people and people of color in the last election. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? I mean, if you look at what they're trying to do and who they're trying to pander to, no one's buying it, right? So if we can fix the left and we can call bullshit on the American fake left that's gaslighting the rest of Western democracy, we have a chance to actually build a movement that could capture the imagination of people and get us back on the right track. And I think the question is not going to be, can we beat the right? It's going to be, can we capture the left and make it stand for something again? And that's probably the battle of the next few years, that I think if we don't get it right, we're on a really bad trajectory.
If you put yourself in the shoes of one of these probably European business leaders who is sitting there and looking at the way the market's evolving, maybe the administration's attacks on the Feds, the bond markets, the behavior of the Americans in some of the security discussions, et cetera, all of these things, Gaza, now the Straits of Hormuz, Iran, and you're wondering, what the fuck now? What sort of advice would you offer?
I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. I think that's the unfortunate reality. I think we're at an economic precipice with a very precarious system where the markets have not understood the difference between markets and between, let's call it, traders and managers, right? Traders are people trading stocks, this, that, every single day. They read the news flow, they bounce around. They can buy and sell all day long and do whatever, and the markets can somehow go up. Managers are people making long-term decisions, right? They're like, do I build this factory? Do I make this order? They're people running the actual companies. I don't think any of them, to use the name of your podcast, I think most of them are basically saying WTF when I talk to them, because they don't know what the hell to do. Because how do you plan for your business if you don't even know if you're going to have tariffs next month? How do you even know at the end of the year? And so I think we're going to go into a very tough economic period. I think there are a lot of valuations that are going to get smashed. I think that the green space is going to take a beating. And I think people will say, oh, it's been taking a beating for years. I think we're actually not at the end of it. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. And there's going to be a real bloodbath. And it reminds me of the beginning of the dot-com sort of saga, because I kind of saw it from the inside as sort of someone who offers in programming at college and then started off in tech banking, and then right at the dot-com bubble burst, and then invested in the aftermath, having switched to the investment world. And we bought stuff at the bottom because things had mistimed the market. A lot of good stuff happens at the bottom, right? That's where great businesses are often created, often because there's real capital discipline, right? You're not funding crappy business ideas or hope. There's a lot of rigor to how the capital is provided. I think that's the silver lining on the period we're going into. So I think it'll be tough, but you could build back better, right? I mean, not to use a political slogan, but that effectively you can do that. And I think that and a political revival is 100% possible, but it needs to happen soon. And I think the rest of this decade is pretty much make or break.
Any comments on how that sort of overlaps with the security situation that we're seeing here in Europe and the discussions about Taiwan, Iran, Israel, et cetera?
I think we're going into a period of power where hard power matters. And I think that because of a number of these things, principle matters less. And I think oddly, the people who may actually hold up and talk about principle and international treaties may end up being in Asia and China more than the West, because the West has showed itself completely incapable of actually aligning with the values it talks about. And that's not even just my opinion. That's what everyone's saying in emerging markets right now. Why wouldn't, right? Why wouldn't they? So I think I think there's going to be a bunch of challenges in the security front also. I think that's probably what's going to create some of the economic instability, because I suspect that China will do something major on Taiwan before 2027. That's what the intelligence says. If I were Xi Jinping, for a bunch of reasons, that's what I would do also, right? Realistically, just looking at timeline, if I were him. So I think we're just going to see a bunch of instability in a number of places. And I think that I think that is going to, it's going to be part and parcel of a tough period where we have a chance to hopefully build something more meaningful in its place.
Well, Tariq, I know you've been busy these last months, so taking the time to sit down and talk with us is much appreciated, and we hope to have the opportunity to do it again sometime.
That'd be great. Great chatting with you.
You've been listening to What the Fuck Now, hosted by Rick Wheatley and produced by the S7 team. We love that you've listened, but we'd love even more to hear what you think. If you've got feedback or ideas for guests or topics we should tackle, we're all ears. Thanks for tuning in, and see you next time.